Investigations involves gathering and interpreting a lot of information, which can be difficult even for the most experienced investigators. One of the biggest challenges in investigation is for certain psychological factors to influence decision-making and problem-solving. These factors, known as biases, can lead to incorrect or suboptimal conclusions. Our brain is constantly trying to make sense of the world around us, and to do so, it makes mental shortcuts, known as heuristics. These shortcuts are made to simplify and streamline the process of problem-solving and decision-making, and are usually very helpful. They are taken unconsciously and help us to make quick decisions and respond to situations effectively. However, they can lead to bias of thinking, as they can cause us to rely on incomplete or distorted information. Understanding and recognizing these biases is important to improve critical thinking and decision-making skills, and to reduce their impact on our judgment and actions. In this lesson, we'll explore the concept of schema, bias, and cognitive bias, and talk about the possible consequences of confirmation bias. We will also examine the factors that increase the risk of confirmation bias and discuss the role of hypotheses and narrow thinking in investigations. Finally, we will provide some strategies for avoiding these psychological traps to ensure that investigations are thorough and objective. A schema is a mental framework or a set of assumptions that we use to organize and make sense of information. Schemas allow us to process and interpret new information more effectively by fitting it into pre-existing categories and patterns. However, schemas can also lead to bias in thinking, as they can cause us to interpret new information in a way that conforms to our pre-existing beliefs and assumptions, rather than considering all the relevant information objectively. Schemas impact our daily lives and can be helpful. Imagine that you're trying to decide which car to buy. You have a schema for what makes a good car, based on your previous experience and the characteristics that you value in a car. For example, reliability, fuel efficiency, and safety. This schema helps you to narrow down your options and decide more efficiently, as you can use it to quickly eliminate cars that does not meet your criteria. However, relying too heavily on your schema for what makes a good car could lead you to overlook or discount other important factors that may not fit into your pre-existing categories or patterns. In investigations, schema can impact the way that information is gathered, interpreted, and used. For example, if an investigator has a schema for what a typical criminal looks like, they may be more likely to focus on and pay more attention to information that conforms to the schema, and may be less likely to consider alternative explanations or to seek out diverse perspectives. This can affect the objectivity and thoroughness of the investigation and can lead to incorrect or suboptimal conclusions. It is important for investigators to be aware of the role that schemas play in their thinking and decision-making, and to take steps to minimize its influence on the investigation. This may involve seeking out diverse perspectives, considering alternative explanations, and being open to the possibility that the dominant schema of the case may be incorrect or inaccurate. By being aware of their schema and taking steps to minimize its influence, investigators can improve the objectivity and thoroughness of their work. Bias refers to a systematic pattern of deviation from norm or rationality in judgment. It refers to any kind of inclination or preference, especially one that is unfair or prejudicial. Bias can arise from a variety of sources, such as personal experience, cultural influence, and cognitive processes, and can affect how we think and make decisions. Cognitive biases are tendencies to think in certain ways that can lead to systematic deviation from a standard of rationality or good judgment. Cognitive biases are often a result of the brain's attempt to simplify information processing. This can lead to perceptual distortion, inaccurate judgment, illogical interpretation, or what is broadly called irrationality. Bias and cognitive bias are similar in the way that they both refer to patterns of deviation from norm or rationality in judgment. But cognitive bias specifically refers to bias in the mental process involved in acquiring, storing, and using knowledge. Cognitive biases can have a significant impact on investigations, as they can affect how information is gathered, interpreted, and used. These biases can lead to incorrect or suboptimal conclusions, making it important for investigators to be aware of them and take steps to minimize their influence. Cognitive biases can also have an impact on decision-making and problem-solving in other contexts. Understanding and recognizing these biases is an important step in improving critical thinking and decision-making skills. By reducing the influence of cognitive biases, we can improve the accuracy and objectivity of our judgments and actions in both investigations and in everyday situations. Let's examine the most common cognitive biases that impact investigations. Anchoring bias is the tendency to rely too heavily on the first piece of information encountered when making decisions. This can cause investigators to rely too heavily on the initial information they encounter, anchoring their subsequent judgments and interpretations of other information, even if the anchoring is arbitrary or unrelated to the problem at hand. Anchoring bias can affect the objectivity of an investigation and lead to incorrect or suboptimal conclusions. An example of an anchoring bias in cybersecurity investigation could be if an investigator is trying to determine the likelihood that a particular employee is responsible for a data breach. If the investigator initially learns that the employee had recently expressed frustration with their job or had been involved in a workplace conflict, they could be more likely to anchor their thinking in the idea that the employee is most likely the suspect. This could lead the investigator to focus their attention on this employee, even if there is little or no actual evidence linking them to the breach. As a result, the investigation may overlook other potential suspects or fail to thoroughly examine other possible explanations for the breach. To mitigate the influence of anchoring bias in this situation, the investigator could take steps to consider a wide range of possible suspects and to gather and evaluate evidence from a variety of sources rather than relying on one or two pieces of information. Availability heuristic bias is the tendency to overestimate the likelihood of an event based on the ease with which the examples come to mind. This can affect the objectivity of an investigation and lead to incorrect or suboptimal conclusions. An investigator may overestimate the likelihood of a specific cyber attack happening in their organization if they have recently seen multiple high-profile media reports of similar attacks happening in other organizations. This could lead the investigator to prioritize these type of attacks in their investigation, even if the actual risk of this type of attack happening in their organization is relatively low. This could result in resources being misallocated and other potential threats being overlooked, which could hinder the overall effectiveness of the investigation. Confirmation bias is the tendency to search for, interpret, or remember information in a way that confirms one's pre-existing belief or hypothesis. This bias can unconsciously cause investigators to seek out information that confirms their existing belief and overlook or discount information that contradicts those beliefs. This can affect the objectivity of an investigation and lead to incorrect or suboptimal conclusions. If we use our previous example, where an investigator is trying to determine the likelihood that a particular employee is responsible for a data breach, under confirmation bias he may subsequently look for evidence that confirms his belief and disregard evidence that points to the fact that the employee had nothing to do with the incident. Confirmation bias can significantly impact the thoroughness, accuracy, and credibility of an investigation and can have several negative consequences. In this slide, we've listed some possible consequences of confirmation bias. Like a lot of the other biases, it could lead to incomplete or inaccurate conclusions. As in the previous example, confirmation bias can cause investigators to focus on evidence that supports their initial hypothesis or belief, and to ignore or downplay evidence that does not fit into their hypothesis. As a result, investigators may come to incorrect or incomplete conclusions about the incident and miss important clues or leads. Inefficient use of resources. Confirmation bias can lead investigators to spend more time and resources investigating leads or pursuing theories that are not consistent with their initial hypothesis, even if those leads or theories are unlikely to be productive. This can result in a waste of time and resources and can distract investigators from more promising lines of inquiry. Inconsistencies in the investigation. Confirmation bias can cause investigators to interpret evidence differently depending on whether it supports their initial hypothesis or not. This can lead to inconsistencies in the investigation and can make it difficult for others to follow the investigation or to understand the reasoning behind the investigator's conclusions. Loss of credibility. Confirmation bias can cause investigators to appear biased or subjective in their approach to the investigation, which can undermine their credibility and the credibility of the investigation as a whole. This can be particularly problematic if the investigation is being conducted in a legal or regulatory context where objectivity and impartiality are expected. There are several factors that can increase the likelihood of falling for the trap of confirmation bias. By being aware of these factors and taking steps to mitigate their influence, investigators can reduce the likelihood of falling for the trap and improve the objectivity and thoroughness of their investigations. Personal beliefs and values can influence the way people interpret and evaluate information. This may cause them to focus more on evidence that support their beliefs and values while ignoring or downplaying evidence that does not. Emotional involvement is an issue or situation that can also increase the likelihood of confirmation bias. Emotions can affect the way people process and interpret information. For example, if an investigator has a strong attachment to a particular theory or hypothesis, they may be more likely to overlook evidence that does not support that theory. Limited exposure to alternative viewpoints can also increase the likelihood of confirmation bias, as it can limit the range of ideas and perspectives that an investigator is exposed to. This can lead the investigator to rely more heavily on their own assumptions and beliefs, and to be less open to alternative explanations. Time pressure can also increase the likelihood of confirmation bias, as investigators may feel pressure to reach a conclusion quickly, and may be more likely to rely on their initial hypothesis or assumptions. Group dynamics can also contribute to confirmation bias, as group members may feel pressured to conform to the group's beliefs or assumptions, or may be likely to accept information that is consistent with the group's beliefs. Representativeness heuristic bias is a tendency to judge the probability of an event based on how similar it is to a prototype or typical example. An example of representativeness heuristic bias in investigation might involve an investigator who assumes a particular suspect is more likely to be guilty based on their appearance or other superficial characters. For example, the investigator might assume that a suspect who appears to be a hacker type is more likely to be responsible for a cybercrime, even if there is no evidence to actually support the belief. This bias can lead investigators to focus on certain leads or lines of inquiries, while ignoring others, which can affect the objectivity and thoroughness of the investigation. It is important for investigators to be aware of this bias and take actions to minimize its influence on their thinking and decision-making by considering all the relevant evidence and being open to the possibility that the initial hypothesis or belief may be incorrect. Tunnel vision, or narrow framing, is a cognitive bias that refers to the tendency to focus too narrowly on a single perspective or hypothesis, and to ignore and downplay other relevant information or alternative explanations. Tunnel vision can have significant consequences to investigations, as it can lead to incorrect or inaccurate conclusions, and can cause investigators to overlook and miss important evidence. In the context of investigations, tunnel vision can occur when investigators become overly focused on a single hypothesis or theory, and fail to consider alternative explanations or perspectives. This can lead investigators to selectively gather and interpret evidence in a way that supports their initial hypothesis, and to disregard or downplay evidence that does not fit into their hypothesis. As a result, investigators may miss important clues or leads that could help to resolve the incident or may come to incorrect or suboptimal conclusions. To avoid tunnel vision, it is important for investigators to be aware of their own biases and to take steps to minimize their influence on their thinking and decision-making. This can include seeking out diverse perspectives, considering alternative explanations, and being open to the possibility that their initial hypothesis or belief may be incorrect. Additionally, using a structured and systematic approach to gathering and analyzing evidence and seeking out multiple sources of evidence can help to reduce the influence of tunnel vision and to ensure that investigations are thorough and objective. Narrative thinking is the process of constructing and interpreting events and experiences in the form of a story or narrative. This type of thinking is a fundamental aspect of human cognition, as it allows us to make sense of the world around us and to communicate our experiences and insights to others. However, reliance on narrative thinking can also lead to bias in interpretation and judgment, as it can cause us to oversimplify complex situations and prioritize certain aspects of the story over others. In investigations, the use of narrative thinking can be a useful tool in organizing and presenting information in a clear and coherent manner. However, it is important for investigators to be aware of potential biases that can arise from narrative thinking and to take steps to minimize their influence on the investigation. This may involve considering alternative explanations and seeking out diverse perspectives and being open to the possibility that the dominant narrative of the case may be incorrect or inaccurate. In the context of investigations, reliance on narrative thinking can lead to biases in interpretation and judgment and can cause investigators to overlook or downplay certain pieces of evidence that does not fit into the dominant narrative of the case, or to exaggerate the importance of certain details that do fit into the narrative. Like other biases, this can affect the objectivity and thoroughness of the investigation and lead to incorrect or suboptimal conclusions. It is important not to confuse narrative thinking with narrative framing. Narrative thinking refers to the cognitive style that can contribute to narrow framing, but it is not the same thing as narrow framing itself. Narrow framing can occur even if an individual is capable of flexible thinking and considering multiple perspectives, but they fail to do so in a particular decision-making context. Narrow framing refers to a decision-making bias in which individuals make choices based on limited ranges of options or information, often failing in considering the broader context or wider range of alternatives. This bias can result in suboptimal choices or missed opportunities. Let's start looking a little bit deeper into what we can actually do to limit the chance of falling for these traps. In investigations, one of the important steps we can take is to develop and test hypotheses. A hypothesis is a proposed explanation for an observed phenomenon. It is a statement that describes a possible relationship between two or more variables and is used as a starting point for further investigation. Hypotheses are key components of the investigative process, as they allow investigators to focus their attention on specific questions or problems, and to develop a plan for gathering and evaluating evidence to test the validity of their hypotheses. By formulating and testing hypotheses, investigators can determine whether a particular explanation is supported by the evidence or not, and can revise and abandon their hypotheses in favor for alternative explanations if necessary. In general, hypotheses are important tools for improving our understanding of the phenomena being investigated, and for making informed decisions based on evidence and logical reasoning. To test a hypothesis, investigators gather and analyze evidence to determine whether the hypothesis is supported or not. This can involve collecting data through observations, experimentations, or other methods such as forensics analysis of digital evidence, and using statistical analysis or other tools to evaluate the evidence. If the evidence supports the hypothesis, it is supported by the data. If the evidence does not support the hypothesis may be revised or abandon in favor for an alternative explanation. There are several benefits to using hypotheses in investigations. Hypotheses help to focus attention on specific areas of inquiry. By formulating a hypothesis, investigators can define a specific question or problem to address, and can develop a plan for gathering and evaluating evidence to address the question or problem. This can help to ensure that the investigation is focused and efficient, and can help to avoid the temptation to chase after every possible lead or theory. Hypotheses encourage objective and systematic investigation. By formulating a hypothesis and developing a plan for gathering and evaluating evidence to test, investigators can ensure that their investigation is objective and systematic. This can help to reduce the influence of personal biases and preconceived notions, and can help to ensure that the investigation is thorough and reliable. Hypotheses allow for the revision or abandonment of incorrect or unsupported explanations. If the evidence does not support a hypothesis, investigators can revise or abandon the hypothesis in favor for an alternative explanation. This can prevent investigators from becoming overly committed to a single narrative or explanation, and can encourage them to be open to new ideas and perspectives. Hypotheses can facilitate the replication of the investigation. By making their assumptions and predictions explicit, investigators can provide a clear and detailed descriptions of their methods and findings, which can allow other parties to replicate their work and test the validity of their hypothesis. Let's explore a little deeper how to use hypotheses. Imagine the following scenario. Company X has received alerts from their intrusion detection system, IDS, that a large amount of data was exported from an internal system. Right after the export, the system detected that there was an upload to an unknown IP address. The upload was of similar size as the exported data. When investigating the incident, the security team can make use of hypotheses and test them to help guide their work. In this slide, we mapped out some possible hypotheses that can be used in the example scenario. We can start out by having two main hypotheses. One suggesting that the data upload was the same data that was exported from the internal system. On the other side, we can have another hypothesis stating that the data was not the same data. Then we can build out both these hypotheses and test each theory. So for the main hypothesis that states that the data was the same, we can have another hypothesis stating that there was a business reason for exporting the data, and another one stating that there was not a business reason. Both these sub-hypotheses are followed up by additional hypotheses. For example, the data was sent to a partner or a customer, the data was exported by an employee, the data was exported as a result of unauthorized access. The investigation team can build out even further, and in doing so, they investigate all plausible explanations. Formulating and testing hypotheses can be a useful tool for investigators to help focus their attention on specific areas of inquiry and to gather and evaluate evidence in a systematic and objective manner. By doing so, investigators can more effectively identify the root cause of the data exfiltration and take appropriate actions to prevent future incidents. It is important that investigators are aware of the psychological traps of investigations, because these biases can have significant impact on the way that information is gathered, interpreted, and used. If investigators are not aware of these biases, they are more likely to fall victim to them and draw incorrect or suboptimal conclusions. This can lead to errors in judgment and decision-making, which can have serious consequences in the context of investigations and the people subjected to it. By being aware of these biases and taking steps to mitigate their influence, investigators can improve the accuracy and objectivity of their work and ensure that they are making decisions based on solid evidence and logical reasoning. In this slide, we've listed steps that investigators can take in order to avoid these psychological traps. Be aware of your own biases. It is important to be aware of your own biases and recognize that everyone has biases to some extent. By acknowledging your biases, you can take steps to mitigate their influence on your thinking and decision making. Use structured and systematic approaches. Using a structured and systematic approach to gathering and analyzing information can help to minimize the influence of biases. This can include checklists, protocols, and templates to ensure that all relevant information is considered and that the investigation is conducted in a consistent and objective manner. Seek out multiple sources of evidence. Gather evidence from a variety of sources rather than relying on just one or two sources, as this can help to reduce the influence of any bias that may be present in those sources. Consider alternative explanations. Be open to the possibility that your initial hypothesis or belief may be incorrect, and consider alternative explanations for the evidence you have gathered. Seek out diverse perspectives. Getting inputs from a variety of people with different backgrounds and perspectives can help to reduce the influence of biases, as it allows for a broader range of ideas and viewpoints to be considered. Review and challenge your own thinking. Regularly review and challenge your own thinking and assumptions to ensure that they are based on solid evidence and logical reasoning, rather than being influenced by biases. Formulate and test hypotheses. Formulating and testing hypotheses can be a useful tool for investigators to help reduce the influence of biases on their thinking and decision making. By making their assumptions and predictions explicit, gathering and evaluating evidence to test their hypothesis, and revising or abandoning their hypothesis based on evidence, investigators can ensure that they are considering all of the relevant information and are not influenced by preconceived notions or biases. By following these steps, investigators can take proactive steps to minimize the influence of cognitive biases and ensure that their investigations are thorough and objective. It is important to note that while hypothesis testing can be a useful tool for reducing the influence of biases, it is not a guarantee of objectivity. It is still important for investigators to be aware of their own biases and take steps to minimize their influence on their thinking and decision making. Investigations can be complex and challenging, and the potential for psychological factors to influence decision making and problem solving is a significant concern. Understanding and recognizing these biases, such as confirmation bias, is an important step in improving critical thinking and decision making skills, and can help to reduce their influence on our judgment and actions. Through this lesson, we have explored the concepts of schema, bias, and cognitive bias, discussed the possible consequences of confirmation bias, and examined the factors that increase the risk of confirmation bias. We also discussed the role of hypothesis in narrow thinking and investigations, and provided strategies for avoiding these psychological traps to ensure that investigations are thorough and objective. By being aware of these traps and following the recommendations outlined in this lesson, investigators can improve their ability to accurately gather and interpret information and make sound decisions based on objective evidence. That concludes this lesson. I hope you found it useful. My name is Roy Borgen and I'm ShieldTech's founder and CEO. If you have any questions, please reach out to us on info@shieldtech.no. Thank you for joining us.